We have a welcome sign that is popped up onto the screen, and it says, welcome to the power of inclusive decision making. It's a blue background with the Rick Hansen Foundation logo, and it says, please note, all attendees' mics and cameras are turned off. We're offering a live caption feature. You can access this feature by clicking on the CC button. Please submit your questions via the Q&A button, and they will be presented at the end of the session. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with everyone. The chat option is turned off. If you need further assistance, please reach out to info@rickhansen.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel, The Power of Inclusive Decision Making, brought to you by the Rick Hansen Foundation. Good afternoon and good morning from wherever you're joining us today. My name is Chloe Angus, pronouns she and her, and I'll be your moderator and host for the next hour. Before we begin, I'd like to share my gratitude for the privilege of living and working in Canada and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. As your host, I'm joining you today from Vancouver, British Columbia, the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I will pause now for a moment of reflection from all of us. Today is International Persons with Disabilities Day. It is a day to recognize the achievements and contributions of people with disabilities, while also reflecting on the work that remains to ensure inclusion and equity for all. In light of this important day, our discussion will focus on the importance of inclusion in the decision-making process. Together, we'll explore the value of integrating lived experience of people with disabilities at every level within organizations, and how doing so drives innovation, enriches perspectives, and cultivates a deeper sense of belonging for everyone. This topic holds a deep personal significance to me. In 2015, my life changed forever when a benign tumor, inoperable, was found in my spinal cord and left me without the use of my legs. This experience has fueled my passion for ensuring the voices from the disabled community are heard, respected, and valued. Living through exclusion has given me a profound understanding of its impact. Conversely, I have also experienced how transformative and empowering inclusion is for individuals and society as a whole. This dual perspective drives my commitment to building a world where everyone has the opportunity to contribute and to thrive. On behalf of the Rick Hansen Foundation, I want to welcome our panelists, Lisa Park, Abhishek Sarathi, and Dr. Mahadio Sukai, and John Turco, and thank them for sharing their stories and insights with us today. Today is about having an open and honest conversation, and I encourage everyone to share their authentic experiences. And while that can be uncomfortable at times, that is how we learn new perspectives and grow. And before I pass it over to the panelists, I'd like to let you know about a few logistics to ensure smooth communication. First of all attendees will have their mics turned off by the host. To turn on live captions, please use the CC button in the menu bar in your Zoom screen. You can also use the caption setting to increase the size of your captions if needed. If you can't locate the link and prefer to view the captions in a separate window, send us a message in the Q&A and we'll send it to you directly. We also have ASL interpretation. The chat function has been turned off so as not to distract the panelists. And I will facilitate a Q&A at the end of the session, but please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. Any questions that we don't get to will be answered and sent via email by the Rick Hansen Foundation following the session. The event is being recorded, and a link to the recording along with the recap blog will be sent to all registrants via email next week. And as a reminder to our panelists, we have a live captioner with us here today, and I would like to ask that we do our best to speak clearly, as that helps the captioner as well as the ASL interpreter to do their job. I will try and lead by example. In addition, please use the raise hand function when wanting to add into the conversation. The next hour is going to be action-packed, so without further ado, let's get started on some introductions, and then we'll dive into our questions. Lisa, let's begin with you. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and the perspective you're bringing to our conversation today.
Great, thanks, Chloe. I'm really happy to be here. As Chloe mentioned, my name's Lisa Park. I am a Director of Strategy and Operations at KPMG here in Canada, and I'm also an accessibility certified consultant with the Rick Hansen Foundation, which I got back in January. So really excited to be using that skill set to go forward. I'm coming to you from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And for visual representation, I am a middle-aged woman with dark curly hair about shoulder length. I'm wearing a white shirt with a cardigan. And I'm coming to you from my very messy office because I couldn't get the Rick Hansen Foundation background. So apologies for the mess, but really happy to be here, and I'll pass it over to the next panelist.
Well, that's a very honest introduction, and thank you for bringing this great experience. I'll move on to Abhishek.
Thanks, Chloe. Hi, everyone. My name is Abhishek Sarathi. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a dark-skinned brown man with short black hair, wearing a navy overshirt, green shirt, and a red triangle Canadian Tire pronoun pin. I'm based in Treaty 13 territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, also known as Toronto. I work at Canadian Tire Corporation on the Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging team. We support 33,000 employees across the country on cultivating belonging for our employees, customers, and communities. I don't usually sound like this. I'm battling cold and some congestion, so please bear with me. But I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation with incredible panelists on this very important day.
Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to have that leadership. We appreciate you. Mahadio, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on which time zone you are in. My name is Dr. Mahadio Sukai. I am a South Asian Indo-Caribbean cisgendered male, pronouns he, him. Medium brown skin, mostly black hair, what's left of it. Wearing very thick glasses. I am wearing a dark red shirt with a red tie and a headset that is actually covering my ears. I am using the Rick Hansen background, but coming to you from my home office in the traditional unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat peoples in what is now Kingston, Ontario. I am today an accessibility consultant and scientist with lived experience with disabilities. I am in my career a researcher, a scientist, an educator, an accessibility professional, and an executive. I was the first person in Canada to hold the title of Chief Accessibility Officer within the public or private sectors, and have that actually be a C-suite level position. And I currently co-founder and co-principal on a consulting company called Idea STEM, which focuses on accessibility and organizational culture change, particularly in the context of STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and healthcare.
Wow, well, thank you for all the hard work that you are doing and continue to do today with us. John, I'll hand it over to you.
Happy International Person's Day for Disabilities. My name is John Turco, he, him. I am early mid-aged male, Caucasian with curly dark hair, wearing a gray sweater and 2 pins, one which is our ERG logo, and the other one is a red triangle for my pronouns and for Canadian Tire. I'm going to do a little bit of a different spin on my introduction, so bear with me. I believe everyone has a story, and mine involves navigating life with physical disabilities and advocating for inclusivity. I am a father, a husband, caregiver, and a fur dad of 2 dogs. I work in the loyalty department at Canadian Tire as the business and digital owner for partnerships portfolio. And to summarize what my role is, I try to discover and implement strategies that generate best triangle membership for our loyalty program and experience for our customers. To complete this, we must question the status quo, which brings me to why I'm on this panel. A couple years ago, I founded Enable, which is an employee resource group at Canadian Tire Corporation, and we are all about fostering awareness, education, belonging, and communication among those with invisible and physical disabilities. By creating this group, it was instinctive. You see a gap and you try to fill it inclusive by design. Even at a young age, I always knew they need to be more inclusive, which is why the will to act is necessary to make progress. Thank you for having me on this panel.
Well, John, thank you so much for joining us and for all of the hard work you're also doing. The people on this panel really inspire me and give me hope, and of course are in good company here at the Rick Hansen Foundation. So now that we have introductions, I suppose I missed telling everybody about my wonderful outfit, and I wasn't going to mention that I'm a 50-year-old female, but I suppose if everyone else has been that honest, I will too. I am a Caucasian, dark-haired lady with the beginnings of gray. I'm wearing a lilac colored cashmere sweater and a double string of pearls, which is a bit of my signature. And without further ado, we have some really great conversation topics to get started with today, and 3 questions we're going to put to the panelists. So let's get started with the big question and break it down from there. And this is really why. You know, when it comes down to it, why is lived experience essential to organizational culture? And I would like to hand this off to Abhishek to be the first one to answer this question. Abhishek.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. For me, I think when I just think about that question, for me, it's all really about making sure that no one is left behind. So I thought about this question in 3 different ways. So personally, for me, I identify as someone without a disability. And I have the privilege to be in a role in an organization that I work at, where I'm facilitating a conversation and journey around cultivating belonging for all. So it's very easy for me to not incorporate certain voices just because of my own lived experience or lack of experience with other identities. And so for me, it's constantly challenging as someone personally, how do I incorporate the voices and perspectives of people who are maybe not in the room, people who should be in the room, how are decisions being made, and for whom are they being made? Internally as a workplace, I think a lot about the power of lived experience in exactly what John, my colleague on the panel today, mentioned. How do we create spaces for employees with disabilities to come together for community? To come together for safety and psychological safety. And John and his employee resource group has done a phenomenal job in creating that space for people who want to work and thrive in the organization, but also need their own space to be able to have conversations and share what they're going through. The other thing that I think a lot about as internally as a workplace is the power of our ERGs or employee resource groups in educating and building a culture with allies. How do we give accountability to allies to actually take ownership for working against what we can think about as ableist attitudes or ways that may be the norm, quote unquote, and how do we actually break that down? And finally, externally as a retailer, so Canadian Tire, I know many folks on the call are familiar with stores and all the different banners that we operate. But something that really touches my heart is when I think about some of our business teams. We recently had our product development team and our customer research team test with customers with disabilities new adaptive camping gear that they've launched into stores to make sure that camping is accessible to all Canadians. But in order for that to happen, in order for that to be successful and to be in service of Canadians with disabilities, they needed to have people with disabilities in the room testing and actually providing advice and guidance on what those products should look like. So that's really how I think about lived experience. It's really about making sure that no one is left behind.
Isn't that so true, that that's how we have to think about people, is to not leave anyone behind, and take a personal look at perspective of that, of we wouldn't want anyone to leave us behind. So I love that insight, and bringing it to an organization such as Canadian Tire is fantastic, and it's a great example to show something like bringing in people with lived experience to look at camping gear. It's a real Canadian thing, and it's a great example. Thank you so much. Mahario, what's your perspective on this?
Thanks very much, Chloe, and thank you, Abhishek, for your perspective on not leaving anyone behind. I'm going to flip the question around. Why shouldn't lived experience be integrated into organizational culture? Organizational culture is defined by people. Organizations are made up by people, right? People run organizations, people staff organizations. And so culture is defined by all of the people who are present at the organization. And that ultimately can take on a life of its own. But at the end of the day, an organization's philosophy, an organization's value, an organization's culture, those are all set by people, right? 27% of adults in Canada identify as living with disabilities, according to the Canadian Survey on Disabilities. In theory, that's a hefty fraction of our workforces. And so why wouldn't we include those voices in shaping organizational culture? Because if we don't include those voices in shaping organizational culture, what ends up happening is the culture doesn't serve everybody it needs to serve, right? And so this seems like a very theoretical answer, right? But I want to flip the question around and say to you, it's not just about making sure that we have client perspectives at the table. It's about making sure that all of our workers within our workforce are present in these kinds of culture conversations. If we do not see ourselves as workers, leave disability off to one side for a moment. If we do not see ourselves as workers in the companies that we work for, why are we working there? Right? Many of us would then disengage, we would check out, we would go look for other jobs. It becomes a problem in terms of employee retention. It becomes a problem in terms of employee recruitment if those cultural values of the company are not as inclusive as possible for all workers. Abhishek, you said this. If we don't see ourselves within the culture and within the values, then it's hard to resonate within that space, right? So I turn the question around, and I say, why not with respect to the inclusion of lived experience in organizational culture? Because to do otherwise means that we're building something that's not whole, that's not complete, and that ultimately doesn't reflect the people in the company.
That is a fantastic point. It really is about the why not. Flipping that why to why not really puts the question forward. There aren't as many good answers for the why not. So with that, I'm going to lead over to John. John, you have some insight on this as well. I'm interested in hearing your perspective.
Thank you. I will say, I think everything has been covered. We have the why, we have the why not on both sides of the table. And some of the metrics has already been shared. 27% of the Canadian marketplace identifies with a disability. Within that 27%, 70% of those disabilities are actually non-apparent, which means they're not to the eye, to see, to knowing that that person has a disability, which is really important to why lived experience, whether it's someone that, if you are the person who identifies with disability, or it's someone that impacts you that's close to have that say and value being implemented into the decision making of whatever the goods or services that are being provided to the clients. From my unique perspective, like, I have a hearing disability. My sister is a person with developmental disabilities. It is not, to your point, Chloe, yours was accidental, came to you at a later time and date, where it allowed you to have that euphoria where, like, oh my goodness, this is a limitation of living. And now, like, I need to create awareness to it. And how do we fix it? Where some may be living it with their own lives. And A saying that I often phrase is that when it comes to disabilities, it's not ageist, it's not racist, it's not ageist, it's not racist, it's not sexist. It can happen to anyone at any point in their time, which means that if you do not have those unique experiences and voices in the room when you're coming to decision making, guess what? You're going to be behind, and it's not going to be able to have that inclusive product that somebody else might be able to create, and that's going to take you out of the market. From a business perspective, persons with disabilities is actually one of the most lucrative markets out there internationally. It was shared in the International Accessibility Report for this year, is that there's 1.6 billion people in the world currently have a disability that equates to about $1.3 trillion in disposable income. So by not being inclusive and having their voices in the room, you're pretty much saying that you don't care about those sales.
And that is so true. And that's such a great perspective on the point of it's just good business, you know, that people with disabilities, as we mentioned earlier, are, you know, a significant portion of the population, and they have money to spend. And if you want to create products that are going to work for all of us, then we all need to be involved in how those are created. So thank you, gentlemen. I think that leads us on actually really nicely to question 2, which this is about the how. So how can we better identify and break down attitudinal barriers in the workplace to create a more inclusive culture? How do we do this? Maybe I'll start with the ladies' perspective on this. Lisa.
Yeah, the easy question. No, I'm just kidding. You know, I don't think we can, I think it's a great question, but I don't think we can talk about breaking down attitudinal barriers without really talking about ableism. And I know Abhishek has talked about it, and it's some of the other panelists have talked about it, but ableism, by my definition, I guess, is that unconscious belief that we all have, me included, that being non-disabled is the social norm. So this word often, I think, comes with rejection from people because it sounds harsh. Nobody wants to hear that they're ableist. And I honestly don't believe that people are intending to be that way, but it is how society has operated forever. And therefore, it makes these beliefs or acts of what we call ableism seem normal. So as an example, you know, how often does someone booking a meeting really think about whether the door to enter the room has either a light door or a door opener? We just assume everyone can open a door in the exact same way. But as a person, myself using a wheelchair, if that door isn't light enough for me to open and wheel through it at the same time, or it doesn't have a door opener, how am I even supposed to get into the meeting or go to the washroom if, you know, I have to use it during the meeting? The only way that happens in that instance is if we provide me with an accommodation to get in and out of the room, which makes me feel different. It's just, you know, just to get into a meeting room. We don't build infrastructure or processes or policies that include everyone. We, in most cases, and I'd say this is changing, and I'm noticing the change, but it is slowly happening. We usually build it for the average non-disabled individual, and we let other people request an accommodation if that doesn't work for them. It is extremely exhausting, I could say from experience, you know, just trying to figure out whether or not I need an accommodation and who to call and what to do and all this sort of stuff. So it often leads to people just not attending certain events anymore, as they don't have the energy to deal with barriers. And so the presence of people with disabilities is not there. The other thing that would be classified, I think, under ableism is the belief that you know what someone is capable of because of their disability. And I remember showing up to an event one day by myself and someone said, "How did you get here?" I said, "I drove." They went on to say, "Oh my God, I didn't think you could drive. That's amazing, so inspirational." I'm like, is that really that inspirational? I'm 40 years old. Of course I can drive a car. People just assume that because I can't use my legs in the same way that other people can, and cars are just built with pedals, so how in the world would I be able to drive? What they don't know is that a car can be adapted to use hand controls. I can drive just like everybody else, just in a different way. but we don't see that in society as, how various ways of doing things is normal. I'm the same driver I was before the wheelchair, and I'd say my husband says now that I have a heavy hand instead of a heavy foot sometimes, but society assumes that because of my disability, I'm less capable. That is an attitudinal barrier that we face, and that shows up in the workplace, where just because someone has a disability, it's oftentimes believed, they aren't as smart and maybe aren't as capable of handling more difficult work tasks, which does lead to underemployment, and it just adds to the stigma. So I think a really important thing that organizations can do to identify and break down some of those barriers is just providing that education and awareness. So for most people, I think if they're aware how their beliefs or decisions impact others negatively, they genuinely want to change that. And the more people are aware, the more they will make a different decision the next time. Like not assuming I can't drive just because I'm in a wheelchair. They'll make sure if they're involved in a renovation, maybe that the builders ensure there are lighter doors and there is a door opener. Other organizations need to showcase that people with disabilities can do everything, just maybe in a different way that society dictates is the right and only way to do something. And oftentimes when we build something, whether a process or policy or infrastructure with diverse perspectives in mind, we just build something better for everyone. And I think that that is something that we need to recognize.
Very well said. The entire idea about that, universal design and building spaces for everyone. And I can certainly relate with, editorial burials of people thinking that we can't drive or do other things, and until we are integrated into those spaces, these judgments and assumptions, ableist assumptions, will continue. So I know that having us get into these spaces, having these conversations like this webinar is really what does move things forward. And I'd be really interested to hear what Mario has to say on this topic.
I'm going to start with a question, and that is, why can't I drive? Right. So I was born blind. I live with vision loss today, and I'm also neurodivergent. So why can't I drive? Right. And the answer is that the cars are built a certain way, and nobody makes prescription windshields, right? And wouldn't that be a nice thing? The other answer, of course, is the self-driving car can't get here fast enough, except that the true self-driving car is still a while away, because ideally somebody actually sits behind the controls of a self-driving car in case they need to take over, right? So I think the conversation around attitudes is underpinned by a conversation around ableism. It's underpinned by a conversation around unconscious bias, right? So there's 338 people on this call right now, and all 338 of us will deny to a person that any of us are ableist, right? Every single one of us will say, I'm not ableist. And I'll say, that's fantastic. I'm glad that you're not ableist. But are you anti-ableist? Right? And so here's the difference between being not ableist and being an anti-ableist individual. Everybody has a bias. And you know what? That's okay. That's actually how our brains work, right? One of the biases that we actually have is that there is such a thing as an average human being. Mathematically and statistically, I don't have the time to give you the proof, but there is no such thing, right? And so there is no average human being. So let's stop designing for the average human being, because that's an intellectual fallacy. Okay. So if we recognize that we all have biases, then we can actually own up to our biases. And if we own up to our biases, that's the first step in saying, okay, I'm actually anti-biased, or I'm anti-ableist. Being anti-ableist means that if we go into a meeting, and I'm going to use my own lived experience as an example. If we go into a meeting and everyone hands out print documentation that's size 9 Calibri, somebody else, not named Mahadio, will actually be the ally that Abby Sheikh referred to earlier and say, hang on a second, this documentation is not readable. Until it's readable, let's not start the meeting. Right? That is being anti-ableist. That's also called being an ally, right? But how many of us will actually feel comfortable doing that? And the issue of how many of us will actually feel comfortable doing that is also wrapped up in a conversation that happens around disability called self-advocacy. Well, the person with the disability needs to be able to self-advocate. That's nice, but my self-advocacy alone isn't going to stop that meeting, right? But if that meeting has 15 people inside of it and 10 people say, until all of us can read the documentation, we should not have this meeting, that is how the meeting gets stopped until the documentation is corrected, right? Unfortunately, that's also how democratic human societies work. We believe in strength in numbers, right? There is no numbers if the person with a disability, who is the minority in the workplace in most workplaces, is advocating on their own behalf. There is only numbers when allies come to the table. So if we want to identify attitudes, I'm all for education. I'm all for training sessions. You can pay me to deliver those things until the cows come home, and that would be great. I don't have a problem doing that. But I will also tell you something else. What organizations actually will benefit from is coaching within this space. It's not just the training for everybody. It's the let's actually have a conversation about how we live these values around anti-ableism, how we live these values around unpacking attitudes toward the average human being, in gigantic air quotes, that exclude persons with disabilities. What does that mean from a leadership perspective? What does that mean from a budgeting perspective? What does that mean from a strategic perspective? What does that mean from an employment perspective, a customer service perspective? Until we have that kind of coaching, and until we do that systematically, unfortunately, what's going to end up happening is the default assumptions around the average human being and the default assumptions around, well, I don't see disability, therefore it must not be real, right? And then that's where we end up with what we have today. So if we want to balance that, we coach.
Well, I think coaching certainly gives us a great solution and would be great implementation. So that's really, really good advice. And we definitely want to uphold the allies that stand beside us, with us, and put that stop forward. So thank you, Matteo, for that great insight. John, quickly, if you want to say something, then we'll be moving on to question 3.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You can easily search up the meme between leadership and management. What is the difference between the two? And then sometimes you will see a captain of a boat will demand their sailors to row the boat, and this is how they do it. And that's management. Where a leader would be one who teaches their crew how to row more effectively and in an inclusive unit, and it'll allow them to be more effective, and then they can one day become the captain themselves. Coaching is that form of leadership. It's a huge, important aspect of what we have in today's culture that is necessary and has been forgotten. There's something that happened in 2020 that has impacted on a global scale. It's called COVID. I'm sure most of you remember it. And we're still exiting this post-COVID world, and we're trying to remember some of the behavioral instincts, but the world has evolved. And we need to adapt, change, and implement what we feel that'll be the way forward. AI currently right now is one of the biggest disruptions in the business. So many industry leaders out there are saying, oh my goodness, AI, it's like the internet of the year 2000. What are we going to do with it? But AI has been around for actually decades. And it's a preferability thing and part of a behavioral cultural impact. For example, how many of you, by raise of hand virtually behind the screen without the video on, watch Netflix or any of your streaming devices with closed captioning on? Because statistics will show right now that about 50% of viewers use captioning for their program. 20 years ago, that number was probably less than 10%. So to impact that change, it means we have to be able to adapt new technologies and coach the new wave of generation to be more inclusive.
Absolutely. I think it's a point where, once you've learned something, you don't forget it. And that certainly stands corrected here in the world of inclusion and equity. Moving on quickly to question number 3, and then we'll get on to some Q&A. Reflecting on your experiences, what practices have helped include employees with disabilities in decision-making? And what steps can we take to ensure diverse voices are included in all levels of decision-making? And John, you had some great points there, so I'll just pass it back over to you.
Thanks, Chloe. I'm actually going to swerve my previous premises and bring up another one, which is like anti-argumentative and debate style, but I really think that this is a very important topic. I'm not a person who's in a position of leadership, like a paid position of leadership, to impact these changes on an organizational level. But through allyship and through the willingness within the cultural identity within my organization, I've allowed myself to be put into a position where I can work on an accessibility strategy in a volunteer role that Abhishek is currently the project manager of, and he can maybe talk to it a little bit more, and how that in itself is going to implement so much good for folks who just can't get it right. So for example, accommodations process, I don't know how many people know this. 90% of people with or without disabilities indicated that their accommodations process broke down prior to a request being made. And an accommodation process sometimes can be a very lengthy process. Could some be anywhere between a week to multiple weeks to months, hopefully not years, and with a medium cost of only $500. Now, that business value of only $500 per person can easily be remedied if that accommodation process with the utilization of technology and coaching could be remedied a lot quicker. And then we get into the conversation, do I even want to identify? We have about 27% of the Canadian market that identifies with the disability, but if you look at any of the organizational ones, and I'm not sure which consulting company used this, but they said less than 9% of employees identify with a disability because they're afraid of being told that they can't do it, because they've been told that they have a limitation their whole life, that they are different. They've been excluded for something that they were born with or something that happened to them later in life. And that is not an equitable or an inclusive perspective. So what we can do as folks who can see that, whether you're a person with disability, whether it's part of the BIPOC communities, whatever the case may be, stepping up, standing out, calling in versus calling out, there's that terminology as well, and education and awareness. The best thing we can do is just drive the right decisions forward.
Isn't that so true? I think those are really words to be written down by many people on the watching the webinar today. Those are some fantastic points about how to make this happen. Lisa, what's your thoughts on reflecting on your experience and bringing people in?
Yeah, well, I think organizations are getting better at ensuring sort of voices of people with disabilities are included. I do find in the present moment that a lot of that is in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which is great because I don't think that was always the case. I mean, I know at KPMG, our Disability Inclusion Employee Resource Group was extremely instrumental in drafting our first ever Disability Inclusion Action Plan. And when it comes to that, nothing about us without us, I do think that is resonating within corporate Canada and around the world, and starting to gain traction. But what I'm really hoping for in the future, however, is that we have more representation at these more senior leadership tables that will have an impact on, day-to-day work or just life in general. Back to my example of the meeting room that had the inaccessible doors. I mean, the designers of that room, the builders of that room, everyone involved with the creation of that room were most likely all non-disabled people. I'm not saying I'm making an assumption here, but I think the majority would have been non-disabled, so they just didn't think about it. They would have likely designed to the minimum code at the time, which was likely also created by non-disabled people, and didn't really think about the implications it would have or exclusion that it would be to a part of our population. So that is why I think we need more people with disabilities at the table, and or more education awareness of the impact of not thinking about that universal design in the first place. We all know, I think, from designing something that factors in everyone is not a significant increase in cost to do it the first time, but if you have to retrofit it after the fact to include everyone, it often doesn't get done. It's timely, it's costly, the return on investment just isn't there. So if I think about steps that organizations can take to ensure diverse voices are included, I think the key is representation at all levels of leadership. And how do you get that? I think first and foremost, you got to hire more people with disabilities. So you need to have inclusive recruitment practices, maybe broaden the channels you're using for advertising postings to ensure they reach those underrepresented groups, implement standard interview processes that are accessible for everyone. So not just by request of an accommodation, maybe just have virtual meetings that include closed captioning, for example. Think about how your practices may be excluding people with disabilities from even applying or knowing about the opportunity. And I think we all know, I think we're all on the same page here, that people with disabilities have to be creative, solve problems, be resilient almost every single day. And they don't check those characteristics at the door when they come to work. So they use those skills in the workplace as well. So wouldn't you value having someone like that on your team?
Well, isn't that true? We
Yeah.
to be adaptive, don't we? And we can help, we can help organizations adapt as well. So that's a very good point, Lisa. Thank you so much. Abhishek, I will just pass it over to you briefly for a couple more words on this, as John had mentioned in the beginning, your insights on this, and then we're going to move on to some Q&A.
Sounds great, Chloe. Yeah, I'll add to kind of Lisa's list here for folks on the call today who might be working in organizations and may want some ideas on where to start, and just sharing kind of what we've done at Canadian Tire Corp. So John kind of alluded to this. What we actually figured and found was really helpful was we really didn't know how where we stood in terms of our current state, on what we were doing well in terms of in service of accessibility versus where we are falling. And so we actually decided to kind of pull together a bit of a strategic piece of work where we're working with a consulting firm to help us do a current state analysis. And that's where we've actually unearthed a lot of examples of great things that our employees and leaders and teams are actually doing in service of accessibility, but we've also identified barriers that currently exist as well. And so through that exercise, we're now being able to unlock and bring people into the room that have kind of created the desire awareness around what are we doing well versus what are we not doing well, gotten their attention, gotten their accountability, and bringing them into an accessibility advisory committee that have voices from people with disabilities and voices of allies who might own a domain of work that can really change and address those recommendations. So that's really unlocked for us to have this company-wide committee and council around accountability and ongoing work. So that's kind of one piece that we're kind of really seeing a lot of traction around. The second piece is going back to what the doctor was saying and John were saying about coaching. Something that we're learned at a more individual level is many of our employees, once they understand the why behind really centering accessibility, centering other forms of systemic barriers and oppression, they need to understand the how. And so one training program we're launching across the organization is a decision-making framework. We're working with a vendor called Title Equality. They have something called Equity Sequence. And whether it's if you planning a social for your team or really building a marketing or product strategy for your business, what are the 5 questions you need to ask to make sure that no one is left behind? And so it's almost a pocket card question list that we are asking people to constantly ask each other in meetings when they're working on things, so that the end output is one that incorporates all voices and isn't minimizing the voices that were not in the room. And then finally, I'll just close by saying data collection. So something that we've started doing over the past 5 years is measuring the belonging score through our employee engagement surveys of people with disabilities and tracking how that is improving year over year. We're looking at commentary that comes in to see where are their barriers, what is working, what's not working, because we really feel like we need that feedback loop mechanism with all employees. And similar to what Lisa said, we're also tracking now representation at various levels in the organization when it comes to people with disabilities. Through our self-identification option with our surveys, we can now see who are the demographics of our workforce. Is it representative? Are there systemic barriers that are kind of maybe between certain levels in the stratum that we need to work through so we can unlock that potential for employees and talent with disabilities? So I'll kind of pause there just in case that helps some of our attendees today.
Chloe, before you go
Absolutely.
to questions, can I interject for a moment?
Sure, please do.
It's Mahadio. So Abhishek said something that's really quite powerful, and I want to repeat it and reinforce it. You can't do the how without the why, right? And I think that the challenge in the accessibility conversation, the challenge in the inclusion of persons with disabilities conversation is that folks gravitate toward the how, because it's a complex space, and a lot of folks will become overwhelmed, perhaps a little bit frustrated at how overwhelming it could be. And so we gravitate toward the give me the checklist, I'll make my website accessible, or give me the checklist, I'll do whatever, right? And the thing is that we can't do that, just that, without understanding the context and the culture and the history and the anti-oppression framework and all of the theory, even the math behind why there is no average human being, right? If we don't understand the context, then the how is frankly going to be irrelevant. Interestingly, I will say this: if you ask a room full of organizational executives, should inclusion, diversity, and equity be strategic or should it be tactical? Everyone will say strategic. But if you ask the same room full of organizational executives, should accessibility be strategic or tactical? Everybody will say tactical, right? And that's a fundamental challenge, because accessibility and anti-ableism is just as strategic as the rest of it, and in fact needs to be in order for the tactics to work.
Absolutely. Thank you for making that point, Mario. I think it really drives home the leadership that's happening in with Canadian Tire organization, and certainly that we can all celebrate the companies that are going up and beyond to take hold of leadership and make this change, and to have true diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we certainly raise our hands to those of you doing that work. The topics here today, I feel like we could go on all afternoon, but we do have a couple Q&As coming in from some questions from people on the webinar, and I'm going to read those out, and then perhaps you guys on the panel would like to respond to this. So I have the first question is, how would integrating accommodations and asking every employee what they would need in the hiring process reduce the feeling of otherness with people with disabilities? Is this the best option?
Chloe,
Lisa?
just for processing, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, for sure. How would integrating accommodations and asking every employee what they need in the hiring process reduce the feeling of otherness with people with disabilities? Is this the best option? So asking every employee what their need would be in this process, to not feel like you're the other one in the room that needs extra help.
I mean, I think I started talking about this during one of my answers, and I really am not a fan of the word accommodation. I wish we would just have something that works for everybody, and I hope we get there as a society at one point. We're not there yet. So I think organizations really need to start looking at just including things like closed captioning in virtual meetings, or making sure the room is accessible. So if someone has a wheelchair, that they can get in, or doing certain things like that. So I don't think asking all of those things of people, what do you need, is the best option, but it's the only option we have right now. And I think until people realize and recognize that, you know what, maybe we just build something for everybody instead of just for sort of that non-disabled average person, I think it'll take some time to get there. But I agree, you still feel different because you have to ask for a specific request, whether it be opening a door to get into the room to use the washroom. I don't think we're quite there yet as a society, but so I totally agree with the question. It's probably not the best option, but.
John, you have your hand up. What's your thoughts?
I want to live in the world where Lisa is prime minister and she makes all of these decisions, because the inclusivity initiatives that she has outlined is fantastic. I actually would love to see a leader have an interview out in the public and just try to navigate through the everyday life challenges that can come from it. Whether it's someone who's physically able, neurodivergent, whatever the case may be, it's different for each unique individual. And I reread the question through the Q&A, and it sounded like I think it really varies. Like, to Abhishek's point earlier, 32,000 employees is a lot of people to ask on an accommodation perspective, and that would take a very long time to remedy. And the thing is, it's seasonal hires, there's constant turnover, and that's forever changing. That's not a constant 32,000. You're not always going to have the same folks staying. Even though if you talk to a lot of the Canadian Tire folks, we have some very tenured people on staff. I think one of the challenges needs to be said. I'm going to go back to, again, I would love to see a leader kind of go through this and see how they navigate it. It's about almost creating, this is way easier said than done, but it's almost like the weaknesses that you have to find a way to make it a strength, to create your own unique branding identity to stand out from the crowd in an interview process. So the perfect example I love to share about my own, again, I mentioned I'm hard of hearing, been that way my whole life. One of my superpowers is active listening, because I have to. If I don't approach with active listening or read your lips while you're talking, I lose my superpower and I'm not engaged with that conversation. And I may miss a lot of what is being said. And one of the challenges through COVID was we went virtually and we were no longer in person, and you could just turn off your screen while having a conversation with someone. And I would always say, you took away my superpower. But then I found out what closed captioning was and an AI summary of meetings and stuff like that. There are tools that you can best use for yourself that are free without identifying that you have that disability to empower yourself and do well in that interview.
Very good point. I think there's so much thought behind that and real leadership and having that takeaway. Mario, quickly, I see you have your hand up and we'll move on to another question.
There is, to build on Lisa's point, there is a better world that we can live in. And the better world that we can live in is the world where an employer says to every applicant who comes to an interview, we're doing the following things to make this interview as accessible and inclusive as possible. If you need something on top of this, please tell us what that is. But here's a laundry list. And so here's closed captioning in every virtual interview, right? Every interview is held in an accessible room somewhere within somebody's building complex, or you go somewhere else in a third-party site to find that. All the documentation is provided, X number of hours in advance, and it's fully readable. Questions are provided to you half an hour in advance so you can think about them. You have large print copies available if you need to study it. All of those things, you can have this very long list of things that is simply just by default making that interview process as accessible and as inclusive as possible. And then if there's more than that, you put the offer out there and you say, we're doing all of this. If there's something else you need to anybody, please tell us, right? And so because employers right now will say they actually do ask everybody, because the fine print says if you require accessibility accommodations in the job interview, please contact whoever, right? And so the fine print says that, so the employer is actually going to say, well, we do it already. Except that I agree with Lisa. I don't think that's doing it already. And so I think you can actually go out there and say, here are all the things we can do. They don't cost a whole lot of money, right? And so put them in place for everybody, and then ask if people want more. If you want to understand and think through how to do that, the Federal Accessibility Employment Standard dropped today. It's public on the Accessibility Standards Canada website. I lead the technical committee that wrote the thing, right? Go look at our clause on recruitment and job application processes. You'll find a whole bunch of suggestions on how to do stuff like this.
Well, that is, a perfect way to sort of round up this discussion. And really, this final question would be solved if there were already people with diverse disabilities at the table, in leadership. That, to me, seems like it would solve the problem. They wouldn't have so many questions if they just had people in the room around the table that could answer those questions with them and for them. So, incredible conversation today. And Just as we wrap things up, I'd like to invite the panelists to share one quick final takeaway with our audience. Lisa, starting with you.
Yeah, I'm just going to go back to the accommodations, and I don't know if she's on the call here today. I think she said she was going to be, but we had my Aunt Ziv come to one of our KPMG events, and I remember this and it stuck with me. I think it was 3 years ago. It stuck with me today, where she said, I had a meeting and I had no chairs in the room. And so people are coming in saying, well, what am I supposed to sit in? And she was like, do you need an accommodation? And so it's not gotten to that point where that's not normal for someone who's able-bodied to not request a chair, but it's acceptable for someone with a disability to have to ask for it. So I hope we get to a place in society where everybody feels included and we have that inclusive environment, and a conversation like this, I think, helps. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Lisa. Mahadio?
I think I think the world that we want to live in is the world where everybody is included. That's the world where we don't think about the mythical average human being, who's about as mythical as a Loch Ness monster, right? And so I think we need to go from here to there, and we go from here to there by starting with finding and putting into key leadership roles the right folks who can start to drive thinking in that direction, right? And who will do things as provocative as the story that Lisa just told about Mayan, right? And those people are out there. Interesting fact, the barriers that are perceived within the disabled workforce to entry-level positions, in other words, technical roles, are actually considered to be much higher than the barriers perceived toward senior level positions, and that's because the skill sets are different. You need technical skills to do entry level jobs, but you actually need people skills to do to do leadership roles, right? And but the thing is, you can't be a leader without having gone through the technical stuff to start with, right? Which is very bizarre because the skill sets are fundamentally distinct. So if you can't get into an entry level job, you're not going to get into a senior position, right? And so there's this complete dearth of persons with disabilities at all levels, and it starts with getting into an organization, but there are those of us who are senior enough who can be plucked and found and put into executive roles to start to shape culture change, right? And I think Lisa said it, you need that representation at all levels in order to drive culture change. But we also need to seriously think about how we actually how we relate to each other, because to some degree this is a relationship to human being question, not a disability question.
Absolutely. John, your takeaway.
Sorry, I know we're almost at time. It triggered to me. A leader once shared to me this acronym EVI, which stands for Execute, Vision, and Influence, which are 3 experiences you need in your professional career in order to move up in your career progression. But it's also true to the state of accessibility implementations and initiatives. And you have to actually, as to wrap up like this whole thing, lived experiences, that's part of the execution. Vision is understanding those limitations, understanding the why and knowing the how. And then you have your influence, which is being in the right position in order to make those changes. And that is what's really important from today for the 330 plus people that were on this call. And for those who are going to be watching this recording after, if there's one main takeaway I would hope you get from it, is don't stop influencing change.
That's absolutely fantastic takeaway. And Abhishek, what's your final thought? We have
I saw some,
Mhm.
yeah, thanks. I saw some of the questions around, just the awareness and acknowledgement that the words DEI are being politicized right now. But really, when we think about it, how do we myth bust and think about what it actually means? If there's no DEI, then there's no ramps, there's no parental leave, there's no straws. So when you really break it down for people on what are we talking about when we talk about inclusion and accessibility, we're thinking about what the panel talked about today, which is it unlocks belonging and it unlocks access for everyone. The work continues to happen. The work has happened before us. So I think sometimes these headlines that we see from other organizations can be a distraction. So I would, echo John's comment to say, I think it's in all of us to be able to continue the work forward and make sure there's access for everyone.
Thank you so much to this incredible panel and the great discussion that we've had. We are right on time, and I'm going to run a tiny bit over to thank Lisa, Abhishek, Madeo, and John for bringing this perspective and thoughts to the webinar. I think it's very, very powerful that, when it comes to disability, my takeaway is, what was said earlier is that it's not ageist, racist, and it can happen to anyone at any point in time. So it makes good business sense, doesn't it, to include people with disability? And I think that's a great takeaway on a business note. And then to wrap things up, I want to thank the Rick Hansen Foundation for bringing us all together to discuss this important topic in honoring International Day of Persons with Disabilities. As you know, the Rick Hansen Foundation is a national registered charity. If you would like to help support the foundation in putting on more educational events like this in the future, I would invite you to visit their website at rickhansen.com/donate. Currently, you can double your impact as all donations are matched dollar for dollar, thanks to Nancy McKay of McKay CEO Forums. Your support helps to remove attitudinal and physical barriers to accessibility and to create a Canada for everyone, everywhere. A short survey will be emailed to you following this event, and you can access it via the QR code on the screen. Your feedback will help ensure the foundation delivers content you want. The panel recording and the recap blog will also be emailed out to everyone who registered for this event, and you should expect it in your inbox in the coming 2 weeks. And please share that with your network. That's how we get the word out there. And again, don't stop. So thank you everybody for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.